Hello, 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 and welcome back to Grace in the InBetween. My name is Lindzé, and I'm so glad that you've joined me today. Now, before I get into today's conversation, I should probably mention that I'm recording this episode surrounded by boxes. Boxes in the lounge, boxes in the bathrooms, boxes in places that don't seem to make any sense. Because this weekend I moved house. And if you've ever moved house, you'll know that it has a way of forcing you to confront just how much stuff you own and you've collected, and how many decisions you've been avoiding for years. At one point, I was standing in the middle of the living room holding an object I hadn't seen in years, wondering why on earth I had packed it, moved it, stored it, unpacked it, repacked it, and continued carrying it through multiple seasons of life. Which, now that I think about it, feels surprisingly relevant to today's conversation. Because moving house has a way of revealing what we've been carrying, not just physically or emotionally, but spiritually. Sometimes we carry things because they're useful, sometimes because they're valuable, and sometimes simply because we've become so accustomed to carrying them that we no longer question whether they belong with us at all. Which brings me back to last week's episode. Last week, I shared a story about standing on a Scottish moor and encountering God in a way I never expected. And if you've been listening closely, you may have noticed that I kept returning to the same phrase. I walked away different. Now, the question is, different how? Because we talk about the encounter itself, the breakthrough, the surrender, the healing, the moment that changes everything. But we don't always talk about what happens afterwards. What happens when the mountaintop moment is behind you? When the Scottish moor is a memory? When life returns to normal? When the boxes still need unpacking? What actually changes after you've encountered God? Those questions stayed with me after I left Scotland. Because, yes, I walked away from that moor feeling lighter, freer, and more aware of God's presence than I had in a long time. But I still had to return home. I still had responsibilities. I still had decisions to make. Life still carried on. And that's when I began to realize that perhaps the encounter was never meant to be the destination. Perhaps it was the beginning of something. And that is exactly where we find Jacob. When we meet him in Genesis 32, he is standing on the edge of a moment he has spent 20 years avoiding. Years earlier, Jacob had deceived his brother Esau and fled. Now, after 2 decades, he is finally on his way home. And somewhere ahead of him is the brother he believes may still want revenge. And scripture tells us that Jacob sends his family ahead and finds himself alone beside the river Jabbok, alone with his thoughts, alone with his fears, alone with the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. And it is there, in that place of vulnerability, that God meets him. Not after he faces Esau, not after the situation has resolved, but before the answers, before the certainty, before the breakthrough. And Jacob spends the night wrestling with God. And by morning, he walks away changed. Jacob walks away changed. And not because the situation had changed, not because now the future just all of a sudden felt safe, but because something in Jacob had changed. And perhaps that is where real transformation begins. When we become honest about what we are carrying, honest about the fears that still shape us, honest about the wounds we've learned to live around, honest about the identities we've quietly accepted as part of who we are. Because if we're not careful, we start introducing ourselves by our struggles. Not out loud, of course, but internally. The overthinking woman, the grieving mother, the woman who was betrayed, the woman who carries everyone else. And after a while, those things stop being experiences we've had, and they start becoming identities we wear. And I think that's why I really love what happens next in Jacob's story. Because after a night of wrestling, God asks him a question he already knows the answer to. What is your name? Not because God needs the information, but because Jacob needs the revelation. Because before God gives him a new name, Jacob has to acknowledge the old one. Before transformation comes honesty. Before healing comes truth. Before a new identity can be received, the old one must be surrendered. And then God says something remarkable. Your name will no longer be Jacob. You will be called Israel. In other words, you are not who you once were. You are not defined by your past. You are not defined by your mistakes. You're not defined by the thing you've spent your whole life trying to overcome. You belong to me. And from this moment forward, you will walk differently. And I want to tell you about what coming home from Scotland actually looked like. Because I think we sometimes imagine that encounters with God leave us floating 6 inches above the ground, or that we come back glowing, radiating peace, speaking exclusively in scripture verses. That was not my experience. I came home to real life. The same responsibilities, the same school lesson plans, the same essays to grade, the same demands on my time, my attention, and my energy. From the outside, very little had changed. But from the inside, something had changed. And the funny thing is, it didn't show up in a dramatic way. It showed up in an ordinary one. Like, I started noticing things again, like how the sun shines in through the window and just makes everything so beautiful. Before, I'd just be wondering about the curtains that are just blowing and trying to grab them and how can I hold them down. But now I was just enjoying it. Those little blessings that I had become so busy to see. For so long, I had been carrying life, managing it, surviving it, moving from one thing to the next. Now suddenly, I was present for it. And I worried less quickly. I would laugh things off. And when anxiety and stress did come, because they still did, I knew where to take it. Now, I'm not talking about theoretically, and not because it's the Christian thing to say, but because I had experienced it for myself. I had discovered that I can hand things to Jesus and I could leave them there. And perhaps that was the biggest change, because before Scotland, I believed God was faithful. But after Scotland, I knew He was. And not because I'd learned something new about God, but because I had encountered Him for myself. And that changes the way you move through the world. It changes the way you carry disappointment. It changes the way you approach uncertainty. It changes the way you walk into ordinary mornings. And perhaps most beautiful of all, it changes the people around you. Because when transformation takes place, it's very seldom that it stays contained. The people closest to us notice. My daughters noticed. And I think that gave them permission to trust God a little more deeply too. But I want to tell you about the moments I knew something had changed. It wasn't on the moor. It wasn't in Scotland. It wasn't during the encounter itself, but months later, at home, in the ordinary. Because that's where the evidence tends to show up, doesn't it? It's not always in the moments. Sometimes it happens much later. I have a son, and from the moments I held him, I knew he was a gift from God. He brought so much joy into our lives in such a short time, and he had the most beautiful smile. He was 17 months old when God called him home. And even now, all these years later, I still struggle to find words that feel adequate enough for that kind of loss. Honestly, I don't think there are any. There's only life before it and life after it. And for years, looking at his pictures, it hurt. And not in a gentle way, in a way that took the breath out of me. A way that reopened questions I didn't have answers for. A way that reminded me of everything that should have been and never was. I keep his photos out because I wanted his place in our family to remain visible. I wanted his smile to continue living in our home. But if I'm honest, there were times I looked at those pictures through pain alone. And I carried that. And then I went to Scotland and I had this earth-shaking encounter with God. And I surrendered things I didn't even realize I was still carrying. And then life carried on. And months later, his anniversary approached. And instinctively, I began preparing myself, sort of bracing myself the way I always had. I picked up his photo, and this is the part it's so difficult to explain because there was no voice from heaven or some overwhelming, experience. It was just a quiet realization. Something was different. My grief was still there. My tears were still there. My love for him was certainly still there. But that crushing weight, it was gone. The questions, I no longer demanded answers. The pain didn't completely consume my memory. And for the first time, I could look at his face and smile before I cried. I could hold my grief and gratitude in the same hand. And neither one canceled the other out. That was the moment I knew God had done something in me that I could never, ever have done for myself. He didn't change what had happened. He didn't change the circumstance. But he had changed the one carrying it. And perhaps that is what Jacob's limp was always meant to teach us. The evidence of an encounter is not that life becomes perfect. The evidence is that we no longer carry life the same way we did before. So how do we carry this forward? The older I get, the less convinced I am that transformation comes through trying harder. Most of us have already tried that. We've made the promises, we've set the goals, we've determined that this time things will be different. And yet, real change really, rarely seems to happen through effort alone. What if transformation is not something that you could build? But what if it's something we make room for? Because when I look back at my own life, the seasons where God changed me the most were not the seasons where I was striving hardest. They were the seasons where I became honest enough, still enough, and surrendered enough for Him to do what only He could do. So, perhaps the invitation is simpler than we think. Pay attention. Notice the places where fear no longer has the same grip. Notice the moments where peace has quietly taken root. Notice the ways you respond differently than you once would have. Because God's work in us is often gentle. It rarely arrives with an announcement. And more often, we recognize it when we look back and realize we are no longer carrying something the way we once did. And when you find yourself slipping back into striving, and we all do, return to surrender. Open your hands. An honest heart. A willingness to trust God with what you cannot control. Because walking with Christ is not a single act of surrender. It is a daily returning, a daily reminder that God is God. And in all of it, trust that the God who began a good work in you is faithful enough to complete it. And the story of Jacob ends with a detail that could be easy to miss at times. After the wrestling, after the honesty, after the surrender, after the new name, after the limp, Scripture simply tells us the sun rose above him as he passed Peniel. And every time I read those words, I pause. Because Jacob still had to face Esau. This conversation that he had been dreading for 20 years was still waiting for him. The future was still uncertain. The questions had not all been answered. And yet the sun rose. A new day began. And Jacob walked into it differently. Not because things had changed, but only because he had. And I love the way the story reminds me that encounters with God are not an escape from real life. Eventually, we all leave the mountain. We leave the retreat. We leave the worship night. We leave the Scottish moor. And we return to normal life. The alarm still goes off. The coffee still needs drinking. The children still need us. and life continues. And yet, if God has truly met us there, we do not return the same. We return with a deeper awareness of His presence, a deeper confidence in His faithfulness, a deeper understanding that we were never carrying the weight alone to begin with. And looking back now, I think that was one of the greatest gifts that Scotland gave me. It wasn't the scenery and the adventure, not even the encounter itself. It was the realization that God's faithfulness had woven through every chapter of my life, including the chapters I would never have chosen. And once you see that, it becomes very difficult to unsee it. You begin to recognize God's fingerprints everywhere, in the prayers that were answered, in the prayers that were not answered, in the doors that opened, in the doors that stayed closed, in the heartbreak, in the healing, in the waiting, in the becoming. And perhaps that is the evidence of an encounter. Not that life becomes easier, not that uncertainty vanishes, but that somewhere along the way, we become increasingly convinced that God is who He says He is: faithful, present, good, and worthy of our trust. The sun still rises. The road still continues. Life still unfolds. But we walk differently because we know we are walking with Him. And I want to leave you with one final thought today. Maybe you're listening to this episode and you know exactly what your Jabbok moment is. You know the thing you've been wrestling with, the thing you've been carrying, the thing you've been trying to fix or control or understand or even run away from. Maybe it's grief. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's a question that still doesn't have an answer. And maybe, like Jacob, you're exhausted. And if that's you, I want to remind you of something. God met Jacob before he faced Esau, not after, before. God met him in the uncertainty, in the wrestling, in the not knowing. And that is where He wants to meet you too. Right here, exactly as you are. Because the goal was never the encounter itself. The goal was always relationship. The goal was always knowing Him. And sometimes the greatest evidence that God has met us is not that our circumstances have changed. It's that we have changed. So if you find yourself in a season where the questions remain, where the future still feels unsure, and where life continues to unfold one ordinary day at a time, don't lose heart. The sun still rises. God is still faithful. And the same God who met Jacob beside a river and met me on a Scottish moor is still meeting people today. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Grace in the In-Between, and I'll be speaking to you very soon.